Hi, welcome to our unit on mathematics, especially how you can support your English language learners with the learning of math. And so, as you know, we're going to tackle this in three parts. And the first thing we're going to do is to tackle the language of math. What's going on with the language that English language learners find in math? Next up, we'll take a look at the cultural issues, and then we will delve into strategies. Okay, so we're going to talk about the language of mathematics today. We're going to cover vocabulary, pronunciation, articles. What does articles mean? The, and. Prepositions, in, of, between, with. And directions, meaning the directions at the top of a worksheet or the directions at the beginning of an exercise, that kind of thing. So I think the place to begin is a conversation that I had last week with a 5th grade teacher. I was talking with her about some English language learners that she and I are supporting together, and she shared with me that there was a math problem, and it was introducing a new idea around fractions. And it had to do with you have 3 fruit leathers and you want to share them with 4 of your friends. So what are you going to do? And she said she was quite confident that the students actually understood the math part of it, but even after 10 minutes of explaining what a fruit leather is, she still couldn't get understanding of that problem. So that's a great place to begin. That's reality. So the first thing that comes up with vocabulary around mathematics is just the straight up BICS vocabulary. What do I mean by BICS? Basic interpersonal communication skills language. That's the everyday language. For kids, that's the playground language, the language of the lunch line. For high schoolers, it's talking about the school dance on Friday, who's going to the game on Saturday, and can I borrow your sweater? And for adults, it's the language of making nice with someone who lives in the next apartment when you're both getting your mail together. It looks like chit-chat on the bus when you're sitting with someone, that kind of thing. So everyday language. So fruit leather, although it may not be your or my favorite food for elementary kids, that's BICS. That is everyday language. And so every other kid who knew what a fruit leather was probably hungry for fruit leathers when they heard about this. But those 2 English language learners were in the dark. And please note, they got stuck. They couldn't go on to the math part because they were stuck on that BICS vocabulary. So the first thing we need to pay attention to when we're putting either pre-made word problems in front of students, or maybe something that we've put together, we've made especially for our own students, is you may be inadvertently losing them immediately because the concrete everyday example you're putting in front of them has BICS vocabulary that they don't know yet. So you'll have to be really sensitive to that. And if it's pre-made, there's nothing you can do about it. Maybe switch out some vocabulary for the whole class or for them, or maybe even have kind of a glossary at the front of the classroom about what these things mean, or pictures if it's that concrete. Okay? So the next thing that we move on to is the multiple meanings of math vocabulary. What do I mean by multiple meanings? What I mean is your students likely will have built up already a vocabulary in English. They will come to you having been exposed to many words in English already. That's great. It runs into an actual, believe it or not, problem in mathematics, and that is that they come with words that they've attached meanings to, and now in mathematics they are exposed to the very same words, but now they have a completely different meaning. So what are some great examples? I guarantee you, especially for English language learners in elementary, that they will have experienced the word gross before they get to you as their math teacher. And of course, when they walk into math class, it has a completely different meaning. And what can happen for English language learners is they get stuck. Unless you specifically talk about, okay, outside of math, this is the meaning of this word. Inside of math, this is the meaning of this word. What are some other examples? Mean, right? He's mean, she's mean, he's being mean. And so, of course, in the language of math, that's something very different. It comes up for them when they're looking at the average, the median, the mean of numbers. And another word, to carry. They almost always will know that word. They'll have been exposed to that Bix meaning of that word before they get to you. To carry something, to put it over your shoulder or to carry it in your arms. And of course, when we are adding, subtracting, etc., we are carrying numbers, and it means something very different. So those are some great examples. Right before this lecture, there's a handout. You might already have it printed out, or you're referring to it right now. I pulled together from many, many resources, plus my own experience, a nice list of words, and there's so many more, of vocabulary items that have a Bix meaning besides the meaning that students will encounter with you in mathematics. And then what I did was I gave a sample sentence of how the students might even have heard that word or read that word before. So anyways, so that's just meant as kind of a tool for you to get you started. I want you to know that there's times 10 that number of words, and there's lots and lots of lists out there. None of them are entirely complete. One will have 50 words, another list will have a different 50 words, so there's lots of them. So that would be a really important thing for you to pay attention to with your English language learners, and to make sure you are going out ahead of any assignment you're giving, any list of word problems, anything at all, and that you are making sure that you are pre-teaching that difference. Outside of math, it means this. Inside math, it means this. You will cut off some time spent in confusion. I also have collocations for concepts here. Now, collocations is a word that you might not have heard before, but it's very key. And if you were to go to a conference in our area, there probably would be someone presenting on collocations. And so what does collocations mean? It's a fancy way of saying a group of words that are related. Sometimes they're related because they have the same meaning. Sometimes they're related because when we talk about one, we tend to use these other words as well. So for example, thought experiment. If I were to say to you, if you have a doctor's appointment on Friday and it's just a general checkup, what kinds of words might come up at that appointment? Exercise, feeling, diet, pain, those kinds of words. Those would be a collocation. They don't all have the same meaning, but they're very related. When I talk about collocations here, I mean the kinds of words that actually end up meaning the same thing, or rather referring to the same thing. So what often happens for a teacher teaching math, the teacher will introduce a concept and they'll use kind of the key significant word that refers to the concept when they're lecturing about it, teaching about it. Then they send students off with exercises. And what the students encounter is the same concept is said in different ways. There are different terms referring to it. So let me give you an example. So if in your class you are talking about numbers, and it's hard to imagine, right, a math class in which you're not using the word number, but what are some, if you send students off and you give them some activities to carry out, or they're even doing them in class, what are some other words that might come up that you might not notice otherwise, that refer to the same thing? There might be placeholder. There might be quantity. It might refer to numeral or amount. And I've actually got more written down here, but you can see where this is going. So one thing that English language learner teachers teaching any English language learners, whether it's all of your students or even just one student in your class, we have to be really, really sensitive to the collocations that come up around a math function that we are teaching. So we've talked about vocabulary, we've talked about being sensitive to the everyday vocabulary that comes up, often as a part of word problems. And by the way, that everyday vocabulary is meant to actually assist the students. And for a student who knows that vocabulary, it will assist them. Multiple meanings, and we talked about that your students, if you're lucky, they come into your class with a developing vocabulary in English that includes a lot of everyday meanings of words that you're now going to ask them to apply a second meaning, a mathematical meaning. And while we're on it, one more thing. There are words within mathematics that students will experience, like for example, the word inverse. Inverse. Inverse is a word that, depending on the mathematical function that you're teaching, even that word changes from mathematics type to mathematics type. So mathematics is kind of naughty this way, so we really have to be sensitive. And so if you, for example, you're teaching high school mathematics, you've got English language learners in there, if you're using a word like inverse, then you'd want to be really sensitive. Have they encountered this word before in another mathematics class, and now you're going to apply another level of meaning? So something to be careful about. And now we've talked about collocations. When you present a new concept, or over the time that you're presenting a new concept, you need to make sure that you're out ahead of the vocabulary that students will encounter that refer to the same thing. And the example I gave you is things that might refer to number, placeholder, quantity, numeral, amount, and there's other examples as well. So I'm really calling you to carry out a higher level of consciousness about the language that your students are going to encounter and taking into account the language they've already encountered. Okay, let's move on. We've talked about vocabulary. Pronunciation. You might be thinking, what's pronunciation got to do with it? Mathematics is written. Well, the problem is that we talk a lot, and actually it's not a problem, as we'll see when we talk about strategies. We talk a lot about mathematics. Now, I'm going to write a number on the board. 2. Okay, and I'll circle it so it's easier for you to see. Here's the number. Different people might pronounce that same number in different ways. They might say 2,632. They might say 2,632. They might say 2632. So there's 3 different ways that particular number might be pronounced. And so I think it would be really important for you, with your class, including the English language learners, is to come up with an agreed upon standard way that you refer to things so that when you're pronouncing numbers, students are more likely to get the right number in their head. They're more likely to automatically and fluently come up with that number in their mind when they hear it read aloud. And if you think about the kinds of quizzes that sometimes teachers give, in which teachers are not giving a written quiz, but they're saying numbers. They're saying, okay, I want you to add, and think about if there's 3 different ways to say this, what might the student write? We don't know, but they're surely not going to write it quickly, and they're very likely not to come up with the right answer as an example. So something to think about, thinking about the multiple ways that things are pronounced. And I can even give you just a little bit of an example. It's not exactly a pronunciation example, but it's rather the different ways that things can be stated. I'm not bragging here, but I was ahead of my classmates most of my elementary time, except by 5th grade, I still could not tell time. And one day we had a snow day, and my grandmother was home with me, and she made a clock out of a pie plate and used little hands to make the hands for the clock. And she started working with me to try to figure out why was it that I was not able to tell time. And we realized it's because there's so many different ways to say the same thing. 8:45, 8:45, 15 minutes till the hour. And so I really struggled. I couldn't get to ground zero because of this multiple ways of saying the same thing. And I think of that when I think of students struggling with the multiple ways that a number can be said. Now, we know that once they leave your classroom, that you can't coax the entire community to only say things one way. But what I know is once I got to ground zero with my grandmother around the multiple ways of saying the same thing around a clock, once I figured that out, that all those things meant the same thing, I was fine. And so what you can do with your students is give them that ground zero. Help them realize that this is what it means. And then you can help them realize there's these other ways as well, so they can get exposed to that as well. Okay. And so there's also another level of pronunciation that we need to take account of, and that the same pronunciation can, with mathematics, end up having different meanings. So for example, if a student hears 2632, does it mean 2632 with a dollar sign in front of it? Or does it mean, our old friend, 2632? And so that is another reason to be really sensitive to being uniform in the way that you pronounce things. So if you only want students exposed to this 2632 meaning money, then that would not be the way that you would pronounce this number. You'd want to pull that apart and make that clear for them. Okay. So we've talked about pronunciation. We've talked about that there are multiple ways of saying the same things. We've talked about that because there are multiple ways of saying the same thing, it can lead to confusion. Including, for example, does 2632, does that refer to the way that most of us refer to money, or does it refer to actually a 4-digit number? And there's one other element about pronunciation that I wanted to mention, and that is, I'm going to write a number up here. I've written the number 2, 5, and then a dot, and then 6. And I just want to point out, if you are teaching English language learners who had access to schooling in their first language, in their first home country, then if you say 25.6, which is the way I would say it, point actually has sometimes a different meaning in different places. And so a point, a dot like this actually might indicate something different to students. It might indicate thousands. And so often a decimal is written with a comma. So just another kind of aspect to keep in mind and to be sensitive to. And if you have English language learners who've already experienced other education, it might be something to kind of look online, see if you can find out any information about that. We'll talk more about that in the next time I'm with you when we talk about the culture of mathematics and kind of the culturally embedded information. And that's very much connected to educational systems, so we'll talk about that then. All right, so we've talked about vocabulary, we've talked about pronunciation, and now we're going to talk about articles. And specifically, I have up here first and second mention. Now, let's go back a little bit in our math awareness, and let's make sure that we're all on the same page about what this means. In English, the first time we refer to something, we use the indefinite article a or an. And we choose between a and an entirely on the spelling of the word that follows it. And you can look up those spelling rules if you've forgotten them. So we might say, a woman came to my door today. And then in the next breath, when we refer to the woman that we've already introduced with an indefinite article, now we switch. Now it is second mention, and now we use the, okay? So we say, a woman came to my door today, the woman was selling magazines, okay? So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, you and I know that rule. You and I know that a woman and the woman are the same woman, right? We've just applied a rule that we know about how articles work. First mention, second mention. So believe it or not, when an English language learner is reading a word problem, word problems often include first mention and second mention. A train leaves the station at 12 o'clock. What time does the train reach? Blah, blah, blah. If you don't understand how second mention and first mention work, it's very likely that you might think there are actually two trains, and that's a completely different word problem than imagining that it's the same train that we're talking about across time. So there are lots and lots of word problems that use articles just to express themselves. And so this would be something that you want to make sure that your English language learners have a handle on, that they understand how articles work, and that when they see and then they see the, it's referring backwards. This is reference. It's referring backwards. Okay. Some other things I wanted to mention. Okay. Let's see. Moving down to prepositions. Now, prepositions are words like with, in, of, by, between, among. Okay. A preposition is always followed by a noun or a noun phrase. Among people, among the people, among people is preposition plus noun. Among the people, preposition plus noun phrase. So the thing is that, again, math is full of the use of prepositions. And students may not understand what they mean, okay? Well, that is beginning to sound like a vocabulary issue, but there's even more depth to it. Very often in math problems, in math word problems, the preposition tells students which math function to use. And so it actually, everything, if you look at it in this way, everything that tells the student whether to add, subtract, how many to add or subtract or divide by is in the preposition. What are some examples I can give you? Okay. Listen to this math example. What is 6 divided by 3? So I used the preposition by. What is 6 divided by 3? Hopefully you came to the answer 2. Okay? Now let me change it a little bit. I'm going to switch out by for into. Now this is a less prevalent thing. We don't hear it very much in math, but you might. What is 6 divided into 3? What is 6 divided into 3? Hopefully you came to the conclusion it's 1/2. It's 1/2. 6 divided into 3. And so there's a great example of the entire way that students carry out the problem. Both are division, but how to carry out that division, what gets divided into what, is entirely kind of hanging off of the preposition. A word that I think maybe without this lecture you wouldn't even have known to pay attention to. I've got some other examples. Listen to this one. Mark has 20 cookies. He wants to share them with 4 friends. He wants to share them with 4 friends. So what does that mean? 4 friends plus the student in Mark. So that's 5. How many do we each get? We've got 5 people, 4 friends plus Mark. There's 20 cookies. Hopefully you came to the answer 5. Okay? Now, listen to this one. Mark has 20 cookies. He wants to share them among 4 friends. Now, among means Mark is stepping out, and now it's just the 4 friends. Okay? How many do each get? And so for this one, 4 friends, you would come to the conclusion 5. Okay? So with and among, tiny little words, not the key words I think most of us would even pay attention to, and yet those prepositions are key to understanding with how to carry out the math problem. Here's another one. It is 50 degrees outside. If the temperature falls by 10 degrees, right? If the temperature falls by 10 degrees, so we know to subtract 10 from 50. But listen to the same beginning of the math problem. It is 50 degrees outside. If the temperature falls to 10 degrees, now we mean the temperature is 10 degrees, not subtract by 10 degrees. So what does this lead me to suggest to you? And we'll talk about it more in the strategies. I would say when you are assigning math problems, whether they look like all-out math word problems, everything in the math problem is a word, or whether it's a mixture of numbers and words, be really sensitive to prepositions and look ahead at the unit and see how prepositions work, and especially pay attention to those places where if you choose the meaning, this meaning of a preposition, you would come to this conclusion. If you choose this meaning, you would come to a different conclusion. So extremely important that we pay attention to prepositions. Okay, one more thing I want to talk to you about the language of mathematics, and that is directions. I don't mean directions like how do I get to the bus or how do I put together this cabinet. I mean the directions that are at the top of a math worksheet, the directions that are found at the beginning of a set of exercises, for example. And one thing I want you to be really sensitive to is the fact that often the directions themselves are much higher level language than the actual math problems. So let's say that you give your students a page of math word problems. If you look at the level of the word problems versus the level of the directions, it's very likely that the directions are at least one step up. And so what I see teachers do a lot is I see them stand in front of the room and they read the directions to the students. If it's that far above the level, unless the student is an incredible ear learner, this is how they learn, the teacher reading aloud is not going to make much sense. So what do you need to do instead? You need to explain it in teacher language, and then if possible you need to explain it in student language. So you explain it in your own language to the students, and then if you can, you call on a student who seems to understand and you get them to explain it to the class in kid language, in student language. And then you are very likely to disrupt that problem of the directions being so far above the level of the student's language. Okay. Here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that now you have a clear sense of where these kind of hidden trapdoors might be for your English language learners. And the very things that could get in the way of them learning the math, or the very things that could get in the way of them demonstrating to you they already understand the math. They're already there. So we've talked about vocabulary in 3 different ways. We've talked about pronunciation, articles, prepositions, and then of course the level of language in the directions. Okay, so where do I want you to go from here? What I'd like you to do is to read the chapter that I've chosen in your math textbook. It's the chapter, the only one that I think really connects nicely with what I had to share with you today. And then there's a couple of online readings to take a look at as well. If before this lecture you did not look at that list of vocabulary with multiple meanings, I'd like you to do that. You might even think about kind of keeping it as a resource, a teaching resource for you. Just as a reminder, you need to pay attention to those. And I'm sure before this you've already paid attention to the video that I posted, how ELLs feel in math. I think it was something like that, especially the first minute or so of the video. But if not, go ahead and watch that, view that, and I think you'll see a great example of multiple meanings coming up in a math class. And so, good luck, delve in, see if now you're starting to develop kind of a better sense of where those hidden pitfalls are for our English language learners in math. Okay, see you in the discussion.